Bido. Thank you, Harley. Can I also thank Barry for his wonderful welcome to country. I think he was a little bit modest. He said that he wasn't sure what he was going to talk about today. I think he did. And he told us. Remember that bit where he talked about kids, about children, about wanting a better day tomorrow? It's what John Curtin wanted. It's what Gough Whitlam imagined. It's what they worked to make real. And it's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present? Can I also start by acknowledging that today is Remembrance Day, 107 years since the end of World War I. This year, as we've heard, also marks 80 years since the end of World War II, particularly poignant given where we're gathered today, because that means that it's also 80 years since Australia lost its wartime Prime Minister. It's a very real privilege to be asked to deliver this year's John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture. And that privilege is made so much more profound by the presence here of his family. His grandson John and wife Josephine, his granddaughter Barbara and her husband Gary, his great-granddaughter Rebecca, or Becht. Can I also acknowledge the many members of Parliament and former members of Parliament who are here with us today? My good mate and former Education Minister Tony Booty, still Higher Education Minister. Zenita Mascaronis, my friend and colleague in the Federal Parliament. Dr. John Cowdell, an old mate Gary Gray. Where's Gary? He's around here somewhere. Great to see you. Bob Kuchera, Cheryl Davenport, Kay Hallahan, Jessica Smith, the President of WA Labor, Mark Reid, the State Secretary of WA Labor. Can I also acknowledge the Honourable Chris Ellison, Chancellor of Notre Dame University, Professor Claire Pollitt, Vice-Chancellor of Edith Cowan University, and of course the extraordinary Harlene Hayne, Vice-Chancellor of Curtin University. All right, let's begin. In Act 2, Scene 5 of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Malvolio receives a letter from who he thinks is Olivia. The letter is a trick, but in it is a message. It tells him, be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, others have greatness thrust upon them. Now that presumes that greatness comes in many different ways, from circumstance, from effort, or from destiny. Mario Puzo's classic The Godfather puts it a bit differently. He says, great men aren't born great, they grow great. I like that one better. Because what he's saying there is that real greatness isn't about titles. It's about choices. It's about character. It's about what you do. Now, however you measure it, John Curtin fits the bill. Of course, he had feet of clay. We all do. He was tormented by the bottle, by depression, by self-doubt. He made mistakes. But he also bore burdens that none of us will ever know. He made decisions that shaped the war and still shape the country we are today. He changed the way Australia worked. He was a practical man who thought deeply. He had that most elemental of virtues that all great leaders need, courage. And he acted with intent. That's why he is arguably the greatest Prime Minister that we have ever had, and why this university bears his name. The kid who left school at 13, whose first job was a messenger boy, still has a message for us today. He certainly has one for me. A few weeks after I started this job, I came here to Curtin University in Harley and gave me a book. It was a collection of Curtin's speeches and writings, and what stood out to me is what you might expect to stand out. Curtin's argument about what makes a university great. He said, a university should find its heroes in the present, its hope in the future. It should look ever forward. For it the past should be but a preparation for greater days to be. Look ever forward. That's what great universities at their core are. They're not just about the past, they're about the future, looking ever forward. They don't just focus on today's problems, they try to anticipate and solve the ones that lie ahead. And they're not just about rankings, they're about students. They're not a place of privilege, they're a place of opportunity for everyone. Curtin also said that universities should be a friend of the reformer, the host ever willing to receive the initiator, the champion always ready to defend the poor and the obscure. And above all things, the university must have a soul. There is my compass. On the first speech that I made as Education Minister, I read that quote out. And I said, let that be our guide. It is mine. It is, I think, what the Universities Accord is fundamentally all about. That's about building a higher education system that's built right for the future. And a big part of that is opening the doors of our universities wider. I don't want us to be a country where your chances in life depend on how rich your parents are, where you're born, what school you go to, or the colour of your skin. No one in my shoes should want that. But the truth is we are. We still are. And it's what we do here in education that holds out the greatest hope of changing that. John Curtin understood that, and so has every Labor leader since. And more importantly, they acted on it. Curtin created the Commonwealth Office of Education and the Universities Commission. He was also a strong supporter of the idea of an Australian national university. When he died, his great friend Ben Chifley brought that idea to life. Whitlam abolished university fees, created the Schools Commission, and significantly increased funding for schools. Hawke and Keating doubled the number of students who finished high school and almost doubled the number who went to university. In many ways, they built the university system we have today. Rudd and Gillard built the national curriculum and NAPLAN. They also built a formula for how we should fund our schools and began the work of implementing it. A formula we all know by the name of its author, Gonski. They also uncapped funding for undergraduate university places and set a target that 40% of young Australians between the ages of 25 and 34 should have a university degree. We hit that target and we passed it. All of this is the education legacy of Labor governments. And all of it has changed us. You can't imagine the country we are today without it. It's the massive increase in the number of Australians finishing school and then going on to TAFE or to university that's the rocket fuel propelling the businesses and the economy that we have today. I mentioned Gough Whitlam a moment ago, and Gough gave the first of these lectures 27 years ago. We all know what today is. Some might even remember the day itself. That fracturing moment in Australian politics. I'm not going to dwell on the dismissal other than to underline the point that Gough made many times, that the House of Representatives is where governments should be made and unmade. That is certainly how Curtin came to power, because of the numbers in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. If it was control of the Senate that was so important, John Curtin would never have become Prime Minister of Australia. I think most people here know that, so I'm not going to labour the point. I do want to talk a bit about Gough, though. He was different to Curtin. He didn't leave school at 13. He went to Knox and Canberra Grammar. He studied arts, majoring in classics, and he studied law at Sydney University. He was never a messenger boy, more a modern-day Gracchi. In his brilliant new biography, Troy Bramston describes Gough like this. He says, he enjoyed a privileged middle-class upbringing, yet stood with the ignored, the disadvantaged, the marginalised and the poor, against the entitled, the wealthy and the establishment. I'll just read that again to let that sink in. He enjoyed a privileged middle-class upbringing, yet he stood with the ignored, the disadvantaged, the marginalised and the poor, against the entitled, the wealthy and the establishment. Take out that bit about a privileged middle-class upbringing, and you can see John Curtin in that sentence too. The two of them, Curtin and Whitlam, might have been born into different worlds, but they carried with them the same compass. They knew where they wanted to go, the sort of country they wanted to create, and they weren't shy or half-hearted about it. Both of them were what Manning Clark called enlargers. Clark figured that Australia was shaped and made by two types of people, straighteners and enlargers. And Curtin and Whitlam were both enlargers, the people who bring big ideas to life. Now think about it. One was Prime Minister for less than 4 years, the other less than 3. But you wouldn't know it from the legacy that they left. It's all around us. I grew up in the part of Western Sydney that Gough represented. My home was just around the corner from where Gough and Margaret and the kids lived before he became Prime Minister. Gough didn't grow up there, but a lot of what shaped his thinking and what he did as Prime Minister was forged by what he found there. And in those suburbs were a lot of people who looked a lot like that young messenger boy that John Curtin once was. Smart young people who too often didn't get a chance, who weren't expected to finish school, let alone go to university. People like my mum and dad. They didn't finish school, and none of their friends did either. It wasn't what you did, it's what other people did. And Gough helped change that. Our Prime Minister today is part of that change. A generation of working class kids who got the chance that my parents didn't. When Gough was elected, 22% of Australians finished school. And barely 2% had a university degree. Today it's about 80% of Australians who finish school, and almost 1 in 2 go on and get a university degree. Abolishing fees was part of that. It opened doors to kids who'd previously been locked out. And it might seem counterintuitive that HECS, the system that Bob and Paul and John Dawkins and Bruce Chapman built, opened those doors even wider. It meant the system could expand and educate a lot more people, and because you didn't have to pay for university up front, you didn't have to have rich parents to get through the door. That's real reform, opening the doors of our universities wider. But they're still not wide enough. And that's now my job, to make them wider. Not just because I think it's the right thing to do, I think that's obvious, but because it's what we have to do. Think about the world that our children and our grandchildren will inherit, the sort of jobs they'll do and the sort of skills that they will need. 60% of the jobs that people do today, 60%, require a TAFE qualification or a university degree. 3 in 5 people in the workforce today have got a certificate, a diploma, or a degree. By 2050, and that's not that far away, we expect that will be 80%. From 60% to 80%. That's a big jump. Now you've got to ask yourself, how do we expect to get there? Some of that will happen organically. The economy is changing. Most of the fastest growing jobs are in areas that require a tertiary qualification. Healthcare is one example of that. If the forecasts are right, we're going to need another 500,000 healthcare workers in the next 10 years. And most of those jobs require a tertiary qualification. But we still need people to get to TAFE and get to university to get those qualifications. And that means helping more of the people who aren't in our universities today to get there. We're not going to hit that 80% target by helping more people from Mossman or from Toorak or from Peppermint Grove to get to university. They are already here. Where this has got to happen is in our outer suburbs and in our regions, in poor families, in breaking down that invisible barrier that still makes many Australians feel like university is somewhere else for someone else. And doing that means reforming our entire education system. It's not going to work if we just change the way that universities work. And that's because a lot of the kids who aren't making it here also aren't making it to the end of high school. And they are almost always the same kids who fall behind at primary school or start behind and never catch up. It's all connected. And that means that reform has to be connected too. It needs to follow the evidence and it needs to follow the child. And the money has to follow them too, based on need. So let's start at the start. The first time that a child meets a teacher who they don't call mum or dad. And that's our early education and care system. I think we know now that that is what it is. This isn't babysitting. This is the time when most of the brain develops, where everything we see, everything we hear, every meal, every smile, every book shapes the people that we eventually become. We know a child who goes to preschool is 1.5 times as ready to start school as a child who doesn't. We also know it's children from the most disadvantaged families who get the biggest bump, who get the biggest benefit from early education and care, and that they're also the least likely to be there. Now think about that for a moment. The children who we know will benefit the most from early education are the ones who aren't there. The result is that they tend to be the ones who start school behind. One of the reasons for that is the way that we fund childcare at the moment. To get real access to the childcare subsidy, you really have to be working or studying. What that means in practice is that the children of the poorest families in this country miss out. Their parents don't get the subsidy, so they don't get access to early education. That's now about to change. In January, those rules get ripped up and replaced with a 3-day guarantee. A guarantee of 3 days a week access to the childcare subsidy for the children who need it the most. No one blinks when you say that every child has a right to go to school and that government has a responsibility to help fund it. The same has got to be true today for early education. And that's what this is about. It's a $500 million investment over the next 4 years. More important than that, it's the sort of change that I think will change lives where it's really needed. Now let's go to school, primary and secondary. Those 13 big years where every second counts, where children become adults. I said a moment ago that no one blinks at the thought that government has a responsibility to help fund it. But the truth is we still haven't funded it properly. In his It's Time speech at Bowman Hall in Blacktown in 1972, Gough talked about funding schools based on need. As Prime Minister, he began the work of doing it, but was still not there. David Gonski gave us a formula to do it properly almost 15 years ago, but it still hasn't been fully implemented, and it shows. The truth is we have one of the most segregated school systems in the world, not by the colour of your skin, but by the size of your parents' wallet, and it's accelerated, and it has consequences. If you're a child today from a poor family and you fall behind, and you're surrounded at school by other children who are behind from poor families, then it's harder to catch up. These are the children who need our help the most. And it's their schools that haven't been funded at the level that David Gonski said they should. It's our public schools that do most of the heavy lifting in our education system, that educate the vast majority of disadvantaged children in this country. 1 in 10 kids today are below the minimum standard that we set for literacy and numeracy. But it's 1 in 3 children from poor families who are below that standard. And most of those children will never catch up. 80% of children who are below the minimum standard when they are 8 are still below the minimum standard when they're 15. In other words, most of the children who start behind or fall behind stay behind. Disadvantage is cemented in. And most of these children are in our public schools. There has never been an agreement to fund these schools at the formula that David Gonski set. Until now. Until the agreements that were signed with every state and territory in the last 12 months. It's the biggest new investment in public schools by an Australian government ever. Ever. It means an extra $16.5 billion over the next decade and an extra $49 billion in the decade after that. This money alone won't fix the problems that I've just described. What we do with it also matters. And that's why it's tied to reform. The reading wars are over. We know what works. We know the tools and techniques that work to teach children to read. We also know that the earlier you identify a child who needs extra help and provide them with that help, the better. 8 is too late. We also know this. Children who fall behind can catch up. If you get them out of a classroom of 25 or 30 into a small group of 2 or 3, a couple of days a week, what's called catch-up tutoring or small group tutoring. And so that's what these agreements that I struck with Tony and I struck with education ministers across the country over the last 12 months or so are all about. This is what it will fund. Evidence-based teaching, explicit teaching, phonics checks and numeracy checks in Year 1 to identify children who are behind, and small group tutoring to help them catch up. Here in WA, 350 schools are rolling out small group tutoring this year with this extra funding. But not just that. There is an obvious link between health and education too. If you're struggling with your mental health, your education tends to suffer. By Year 9, students experiencing poor mental health are on average 1.5 to 2.8 years behind their friends in class in literacy and numeracy. Just let me tell you that again, let that sink in. If you're experiencing challenges with your mental health, by Year 9, you're likely to be 1.5 to almost 3 years behind the rest of the class in literacy and numeracy. And that's why some of this funding will also be focused here to support a range of different health and wellbeing services. Again, here in WA, that includes funding complex behaviour support coordinators this year in 192 schools, and a pilot next year of full service schools where you can potentially have nurses, psychologists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, all on the one site, all in the one location. The first thing I did when I got this job, before I came to Curtin University, was to go back to my old primary school, Cabramatta Public School, and give Mrs. Fry a hug. Kathy taught me in Year 1. She actually showed me some of my results a couple of weeks ago. Apparently I got 49 out of 50 in one test, which I thought was pretty good until she told me that the other half of the class got 50 out of 50. The important thing is Kathy is still there at the same school, changing lives. I went there for a reason. I wanted to make it clear what I think is important, who I think are important. There is no more important job in the world than being a teacher. John Curtin didn't live long enough to meet any of his grandchildren, but I'm sure he would be very proud to know that amongst them were 2 primary school teachers, Barbara and Beverly, and a great-granddaughter, Beck, who has a master's in teaching and now leads the Rising Scholars program at the university that bears her great-grandfather's name. Whitlam called teachers the nucleus of the education system. Nothing works without them. Incidentally, Goff's sister Frida was also a teacher and a principal. We need more teachers, and we need to give them more support. And that starts here at university. This year, paid prac has started. For the first time ever, the Commonwealth Government providing financial support to teaching students while they do their prac, their practical training. And next year, the core content of their teaching degree will also change. This is a big change. We want to make sure that students here at university are being taught the same evidence-based explicit teaching techniques to teach every child to read and write and count that we're also rolling out in schools across the country. Next year, we'll also do some keyhole surgery on the national curriculum to make it simpler and easier to teach. And we're going to start with maths. And we're going to start with the first 3 years of maths. And this is why. A basic grasp of maths is critical for work and life. If you get maths, it really does set you up for success. And I'm saying that as somebody who hated maths. And what's more important with maths than perhaps anything else is to get the basics early. If you don't get the basics right at the start, you can't build on it, because learning maths is cumulative. You learn it step by step. That's why we've got to get the first 3 years right. A number of principals and teachers have told us that they think the current curriculum's too complex. Others have told us that they need more support to implement it with better advice about what to teach in the right order. And that's why we're starting here. It's the first part of the curriculum that we're going to work on, but it won't be the last. A couple of weeks ago, Education Ministers also agreed on the need for another important reform, something that's also been talked about for a long time, and that's bringing together the bodies that are currently responsible for the national curriculum, for national testing, for national teacher standards, and for independent research under one roof, an Australian Teaching and Learning Commission. Something that has the potential to be bigger than the sum of its parts, to do all of this work and more, to improve coordination, to oversee and drive the reforms that we're making to initial teacher education in our universities, and to help us to implement the reforms and hit the targets that every government in the country has signed up to do. And the big one, the big target is this: turning around the decline in the number of students finishing high street. About 10 years ago, about 85% of Australian students finished high school. Now it's 80%. And that's overall. It conceals something even more concerning. Because in our public schools, it's dropped from 83% to 74%. Got to turn that around. And that's ultimately what these agreements, what this funding, what these reforms are all about. If more jobs are going to require a TAFE qualification or a uni degree, then we need more people to finish school. That's just a fact. And that's why in these agreements we've signed, we've set ourselves the target to lift the percentage of students who receive a Year 12 certificate by 7.5 percentage points in the next 5 years. What does that mean? Well, it means if we hit that target, it'll be the highest proportion of Australian students to finish high school ever. Won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. And that brings me finally here to university. Everything that I've talked about today will help open the doors of our universities wider to more Australians. But on its own, it's not enough. Reform doesn't start at university, but it doesn't end here either. And that's what the Universities Accord that Harlene mentioned in her introduction is all about. It's a blueprint for how we reform our entire higher education system over the next decade and the decade after that, to break down that invisible barrier that stops so many people from giving university a crack. To do that, it recommends a number of things. One of those is increasing the number of free university bridging courses. Those courses that give you the skills to start a university degree. And let me give you just one example. Z Johnson did one of these courses when she was 48. At the time, she was on a carer's pension looking after her husband, who'd had a stroke. Now Z has a degree in biomedical science. And this year, she completed an honours degree in ovarian cancer research. Next year, she's starting a PhD. From a pension to a PhD. That's what these free bridging courses do. And that's why we're uncapping funding for them. It means about an extra $1 billion over the next 10 years. More importantly, it means more people like Z. The Accord also recommends setting up more university study hubs in the regions, in the bush, and in our outer suburbs. These are places that bring university closer to where people live. It's all part of breaking down that invisible barrier I just mentioned. When university is closer to where you live, it saves you time, it saves you money. It makes it easier to get to your part-time job or to pick up the kids from school. And that's why we're more than doubling the number of them, from 34 to 69. And that includes one that opened a couple of months ago in Ellenbrook, here in Perth, one that opened in Mandurah a few weeks ago, another one in Northam that I opened this morning or maybe this afternoon, and another one that'll open in Armidale in a few months' time. Next year, more students will start a university degree in Australia than ever before. And even more will start a university degree the year after that. Over the next decade, we'll fund an extra 200,000 commencing places at university. And they'll be shaped and supported by two big reforms. The first is what the Accord calls demand-driven equity. The government currently provides universities with a capped amount of funding for Australian students. The Accord recommends that we uncap that for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. In other words, if you get the marks to the course that you want to do, you get a place at university. The second big reform is needs-based funding. Think Gonski for universities. The school funding system provides schools with the extra funding that they need based on where they're located and the needs of the students that they're educating. Students who come from economically disadvantaged families are given additional support. That's the Gonski model. The Accord recommends that we do the same for universities. It means extra funding for mentoring, academic and other support to help students make it through university. Now, there are already programs like HEP that do this, but this is different. This isn't a capped program, it's demand-driven. The money follows the student. The more students a university has that meet the criteria, the more funding they'll receive. In the next 12 months or so, we'll turn these two big engines on. Needs-based funding starts in January, only a couple of weeks away, and demand-driven equity starts a year after that. Here at Curtin, at least 25% of students already come from those disadvantaged backgrounds. I can hear Harlene saying, it's 27, Jason. The great ambition with all of this is to make that true nationwide. And I'm not naive. I know how hard this is. but countries aren't changed by people who just say it's too hard. Doing this will take more than one budget, more than one minister, and more than one government. This is a national project and it needs bipartisanship. And it needs something that's going to drive it and sustain it and push this reform over the next decade and the one after that. Something that makes sure that the rest of the accord doesn't just gather dust. And that's the task of the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. And I'll introduce legislation to formally create it in 2 weeks' time. Its job will be to craft compacts with individual universities, setting out the number of domestic and international students that they'll teach, to get the sector to work more like a system, to get the vocational and the higher education systems working more closely together, more joined up, to plan for the future, to provide expert independent advice, and to help to drive real and lasting reform. The Universities Commission, the first Universities Commission, you might remember, was created by John Curtin. In a sense, he is the progenitor for everything that I've talked about today. What every Labor government has done since him and what we're now seeking to do too, to build a better and a fairer education system, and through that, a better and a fairer country. In his book, Curtin's Gift, John Edwards makes the point that great reformers like FDR remade his nation before the war. Clement Attlee did it after the war. John Curtin did it while the war was raging, which makes you wonder, what if? This is Gough Whitlam speaking about John Curtin in 1974. If ever a man, I can't do the voice. If ever a man was born to lead this nation into a time of peace, and in the paths of peace, it was John Curtin. If ever a man was born to apply his vision of what Australia at peace could be, his vision of what Australia at peace should become in his time, it was John Curtin. I started by talking about how we measure greatness, and I quoted Shakespeare and I quoted The Godfather. Let me end by quoting my favourite author, Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway said, "There is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow men. True nobility is being superior to your former self." He goes further in A Farewell to Arms. The world, he says, breaks all of us, but some of us get stronger in the broken places. Now, there's a bit of obvious self-reflection from a brilliant and broken man there, but there's wisdom too. There is a greatness that lies within all of us. What he's telling us is that we shouldn't judge someone by a mark or a rank or a title or their job, but by something deeper and more important, by a determination to be better tomorrow than we are today. It's what Whitlam meant when he talked about uplifting the horizons of the Australian people. And it's what John Curtin tells us to look ever forward. The motto of this university. A message from a man who understood the power and the purpose of education. A man who got stronger in the broken places. And we are all the beneficiaries of that.